I'm Marc, and on this channel I talk about UK politics and Brexit from an outside view, although I do know the UK from the inside as well. Brexiteers still claim today that Brexit has brought them freedom, great opportunities, and of course sovereignty. They particularly like to argue that they can conclude much better trade agreements without the EU. So let's take a look at these successes. And today we will compare the trade agreements with New Zealand that both have. The trade agreement between the United Kingdom and New Zealand, signed on February 28th in 2022, offers numerous advantages for both sides, but also brings with it some specific challenges and disadvantages for the United Kingdom. Compared to the EU-New Zealand agreement, some of these disadvantages may be particularly salient. And of course, I do have some key points about this for you. First, we have less market access for services. In the UK-New Zealand agreement, it says that the UK-New Zealand trade agreement provides access conditions for UK services, but not to the extent of the EU agreement. The exact conditions for UK service providers are limited to certain areas and do not necessarily offer the same free access or benefits as the EU agreement does. And for example, if a UK financial services company wants to operate in New Zealand, it could face more regulatory hurdles than a European company operating under the EU-New Zealand agreement. And in the EU-New Zealand agreement, the EU agreement includes comprehensive arrangements for access to services markets, including detailed rules and agreements that allow European service providers to participate much more easily. For example, EU companies in the financial services sector do enjoy easier conditions and greater market access in New Zealand under this agreement than the UK companies do under the UK-New Zealand agreement. And we have to have a look at the point that there is no comprehensive customs union. In the UK-New Zealand agreement, the UK does not have comprehensive customs union status in their agreement, which means that there will be tariffs or trade barriers for some goods that have not been fully eliminated. And in this case, certain products such as machinery or chemical products may still have tariffs or other trade barriers that make trade more expensive and still more complicated. And once again, we have a look at the EU-New Zealand agreement here. Because the EU and New Zealand have deeper rules for reducing tariffs within a more economically comprehensive union, or on the basis of greater market access, however you want to put this. And this facilitates the free movement of goods and creates fewer barriers to trade. For example, a company in the EU that benefits from lower tariffs and simplified trade because the rules are supported by the EU's greater economic unity. And we have to have a look at the access to the agricultural markets. And once again, we start with the UK-New Zealand agreement. The agreement allows New Zealand to export larger quantities of agricultural products such as beef and lamb, which puts pressure on the UK agricultural market. For example, New Zealand lamb could enter the UK market at lower prices, which then puts financial strain on UK sheep farmers. And here once again we also will have a look at the EU-New Zealand agreement. The EU has implemented specific safeguards for its agricultural markets to ensure that competition remains fair and domestic producers are protected. Because EU farmers are better protected from competition with New Zealand agricultural products through quotas or tariffs, despite that there is an agreement. And we have to talk about the different regulatory standards. In the UK-New Zealand agreement, the agreement contains specific regulatory standards tailored for the UK, and these standards are still not as harmonized or in-depth as those of the EU. For example, there are differences in food safety standards that make it difficult to trade certain products if they do not comply with UK or New Zealand regulations because they are not harmonized. In the EU-New Zealand agreement, there are some, let's say, more comprehensive and harmonized regulatory standards that allow easier access to markets, and they just simplify the trade relations. Uniform standards in the EU do facilitate trade for companies operating in several EU countries, and that is one of the major advantages here for the New Zealand side. And of course, we do know about the lack of negotiating power. The UK negotiates as a single country, and with this has less bargaining power than the EU as a large economic bloc. And this means that certain trade benefits or concessions can just not be negotiated as generously. The UK received fewer concessions in areas such as services or investment because New Zealand has less incentive to make broader concessions. They had to do that with the EU, so compared to the EU, it's less. And in the EU-New Zealand agreement, the EU, as a large economic bloc, often has much more bargaining power to negotiate broader and even more advantageous trade terms. The EU was able to secure better terms of access to New Zealand markets and also better arrangements for specific industries than the UK did. And of course, we have to talk about the limited experience and predictability. In case of the UK-New Zealand relationship, the UK has had to redevelop its own trade strategies and agreements, which led to uncertainty as it relies on new experience in negotiations. That's why renegotiated contracts present initial uncertainties or challenges, particularly when complex